Have you ever wondered how a nation could conquer its own land? The history of the United States is not just a story of territorial expansion, but a turbulent journey of the people who lived here for thousands of years. In this video, we will explore one of the darkest and most complex chapters in American history: the expansion, invasion, and broken treaties with the Native American tribes. Join me as we dive into untold stories, shocking events, and the lessons that still resonate today. Part 1. The Grand Beginning. The vast and diverse landmass that we know today as the United States of America was once home to a multitude of tribes and native nations. From the towering alpine mountains to the serene coastal shores and barren deserts, this landscape was theirs, land that held generations of traditions, cultures, and livelihoods. Yet everything changed in the early 19th century when the ambitions of a growing nation clashed with the existence of these indigenous peoples. Imagine this. In the spring of 1803, two American diplomats in Paris struck a deal so monumental, so transformative, that it doubled the size of the United States with a single stroke of a pen. This was the Louisiana Purchase. The price? Just $15 million, a sum that seemed almost trivial for the immense lands stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. But here's the catch. The land didn't belong to France, nor to the United States. It belonged to the Native American tribes who had lived there for centuries, if not millennia. So what was the U.S. actually purchasing? This moment marked the beginning of what would become a harrowing journey for the indigenous peoples of North America. The United States, in its quest to expand, had to reckon with these native nations whose lands they desired. Unlike European empires of old, the U.S. promised justice, fairness, and humanity. George Washington himself declared that the new nation would treat Native American affairs with great principles of justice. They wouldn't conquer, they would negotiate. They would offer compensation in the form of treaties, signed agreements that promised prosperity and peace for both sides. But history would tell a different story. Part 2. Expansion through diplomacy. As European settlers poured into the newly acquired territories, the U.S. government initiated negotiations with various tribes. At first, the approach seemed peaceful. The settlers offered food, farming equipment, cash, and even services like blacksmithing in exchange for land. Some tribes accepted the terms, albeit reluctantly. However, many others resisted, unwilling to abandon their ancestral homelands for what they considered paltry compensation. After all, how could farming equipment compare to the lands their ancestors had cultivated for thousands of years? Here is where the U.S. government's ideals began to unravel. While treaties were signed, many of these agreements were anything but fair. Some were forged under duress, while others were outright fraudulent. In one notable case, tribal leaders were given alcohol and coerced into signing away vast swaths of land, while in other instances, individuals with no authority were appointed as leaders and made to sign treaties on behalf of entire nations. In reality, the U.S. wasn't interested in justice. It was interested in expansion, and the methods to achieve that became increasingly ruthless. Part 3. The First Resistance. Despite the U.S. quote, as seemingly peaceful attempts at negotiation, resistance from native tribes was inevitable. In the Great Lakes region, for instance, several tribes drew a hard line. They informed U.S. negotiators that a river would be the boundary and warned them not to cross it. But the U.S., ever hungry for more land, didn't listen. A series of conflicts ensued, with the United States initially suffering multiple defeats. However, persistence paid off. After a string of battles, the U.S. finally emerged victorious and forced the tribes to sign a treaty that relinquished control of nearly all of present-day Ohio. The story repeated itself across the continent. In the Southeast, the Seminole tribes were met with the same fate. Despite attempts to stand their ground, they were eventually overwhelmed by U.S. military forces. Thousands were killed, and those who survived were driven into inhospitable swamps, far removed from their fertile lands near the ocean. The U.S. had one goal: cleared the land for its ever-growing population of European settlers. And it would stop at nothing to achieve this. Part 4. The Broken Promises. As the United States continued to expand, promises were made and broken with alarming regularity. In Alabama, for instance, the Muskogee, also known as Creek Nation, made a significant concession. They agreed to sell part of their land in exchange for a promise that they would be allowed to keep the rest. The U.S. agreed, and for a brief time, the Muskogee retained their ancestral lands. But this promise would soon crumble. Just a few years later, white settlers began encroaching on their territory once again. The U.S. military, instead of defending the treaty, was called in to forcibly remove the Muskogee from their lands. Such betrayals became common practice. It wasn't enough for the U.S. government to secure land through treaties. It continuously violated those agreements when it suited its interests. The pursuit of power, land, and resources took precedence over justice and humanity. The tribes soon realized that they were fighting a losing battle, and many began to adopt a new strategy: sign the treaties, take the compensation, and move westward, hoping to live in peace on the land allocated to them by the government. Part 5. The Great Ethnic Cleansing. Between the early 19th century and the late 1830s, the U.S. signed 368 treaties with various Native American tribes, each one moving the tribes further westward, out of their ancestral lands. One by one, they were pushed aside to make way for white settlers. While the U.S. government kept detailed records of these transactions, spreadsheets and paperwork that made it seem like justice was being served, the truth was far more sinister. This wasn't diplomacy, it was imperial conquest in disguise. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Southeast, where 5 large nations, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, and Seminole, were particularly resistant to U.S. efforts. These tribes had assimilated many aspects of European culture, from farming practices to clothing styles, and even owned African slaves. The U.S. government recognized their sovereignty through treaties, but the lure of fertile cotton-growing land proved too tempting for Southern farmers and slave owners. Part 6. The Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears. One of the most tragic and consequential policies enacted by the United States was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This legislation, pushed by President Andrew Jackson, was designed to forcibly relocate Native American tribes from their lands in the southeastern United States to designated Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi River, in what is now Oklahoma. The government painted this as a necessary solution to the growing tension between settlers and tribes, promising the natives that they would have land in the West, where they could live peacefully without further interference. But the reality was far from the promises. Under this law, tribes were given a choice: sign treaties and move voluntarily, or face violent military intervention. The U.S. government and military began their campaign to remove the 5 large tribes from the Southeast, including the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. Although many resisted, the sheer power of the U.S. military, combined with the relentless pressure from white settlers, forced them into submission. The journey westward became known as the Trail of Tears, a name given by the Cherokee people who were among those forcibly removed. It was a grueling march of over 1,000 miles, through harsh weather, inadequate supplies, and deadly diseases. Entire communities, men, women, children, and the elderly, were made to walk under brutal conditions, and many did not survive. Estimates of the number of deaths vary, with some accounts suggesting as many as 15,000 Native Americans perished during this forced migration. This wasn't just a physical removal. It was the systematic destruction of entire ways of life. The land that had once been the foundation of their culture, their livelihoods, and their identities was stripped from them. The United States had promised that the Indian Territory would be theirs forever, but history would once again prove this promise to be short-lived. Part 7. Betrayal after betrayal. The promises made to Native American tribes under the Indian Removal Act didn't last long. Despite the assurances that they would be left in peace in their new territories, the U.S. government quickly broke its word. As settlers began to push further west, the land allocated to the tribes became increasingly desirable. Resources such as gold and fertile soil attracted more white settlers, and soon, even the territories that were promised to the native nations were being encroached upon. The discovery of gold in particular was a game changer. In the Black Hills of South Dakota, the Lakota Sioux were initially successful in defending their land from U.S. military forces. They signed a peace treaty with the government that recognized their control over the Black Hills. But just a few years later, gold was discovered there, and the government's resolve to honor the treaty vanished. Once again, native lands were taken, boundaries were redrawn, and settlers flooded into the area, often with the backing of the U.S. military. The betrayal was clear. Every treaty, every agreement, was little more than a temporary measure, meant to hold off resistance long enough for the government to figure out a new way to seize more land. Native American tribes were left with few options. They could resist and face brutal repression, or they could accept the inevitability of losing their lands and try to make the best of their new circumstances. But no matter which path they chose, the outcome was the same: the loss of their ancestral homelands, their culture, and in many cases, their lives. Part 8. Legal Resistance and the Supreme Court. One of the most notable examples of Native American resistance during this time came from the Cherokee Nation, which took its case all the way to the Supreme Court. After the state of Georgia attempted to abolish the Cherokee government and take their land, the Cherokee fought back by utilizing the American legal system. In a landmark case, Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, affirming that they had the right to their land and that state governments had no authority over Native American nations. It was a victory on paper, but in practice, it meant very little. President Andrew Jackson famously defied the ruling, stating, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Jackson's refusal to uphold the Supreme Court's decision paved the way for the Indian Removal Act to be fully implemented, and the Cherokee, along with other tribes, were forced to leave their homes despite the legal recognition of their sovereignty. This moment is a stark reminder of the limits of the U.S. legal system when it came to protecting Native American rights. The law, which was supposed to ensure justice, was ignored when it conflicted with the government's broader goals of expansion and conquest. The Cherokee may have won in court, but they ultimately lost their land, their homes, and their freedom. Part 9. The 20th Century and the Fight for Sovereignty. As the 20th century progressed, Native American tribes began to organize and fight for their rights in new ways. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted Native Americans U.S. citizenship, but this did little to address the ongoing issues of land dispossession, poverty, and cultural erasure. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that Native Americans began to gain greater recognition and support for their struggles. The American Indian Movement, AM, founded in 1968, played a key role in advocating for Native American rights. AM organized protests and occupied government buildings to draw attention to the issues facing Native American communities. One of the most famous actions was the occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969, where Native American activists demanded the return of federal lands that had been taken from them. The fight for sovereignty also gained momentum during this time. Tribes began to assert their rights to self-governance, and the U.S. government gradually began to recognize tribal sovereignty in a more meaningful way. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 was a landmark piece of legislation that allowed tribes to have greater control over their own affairs, including education and healthcare. Part 10. Cultural Erasure and the Boarding School System. In addition to the physical dispossession of land, Native Americans also faced a concerted effort to erase their cultures and identities. One of the most notorious aspects of this campaign was the establishment of Indian boarding schools. These schools, which were run by the federal government and religious organizations, sought to civilize Native American children by stripping them of their language, culture, and traditions. Children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in these schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their cultural traditions. The motto of the boarding schools was often summed up as, "Kill the Indian, save the man," reflecting the belief that Native American identity needed to be eradicated in order for them to become civilized members of American society. The impact of the boarding school system was profound. Many Native American children suffered physical and emotional abuse in these institutions, and the trauma of being separated from their families and cultures left deep scars. The boarding schools were a key part of the U.S. government's broader effort to assimilate Native Americans, but instead, they contributed to the destruction of indigenous cultures and the deepening of intergenerational trauma. Part 11. Reflections and Reconciliation. As we reflect on the history of how the United States colonized its own land, it is essential to confront the difficult truths about the nation's past. The systematic displacement and oppression of Native American peoples were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of conquest and exploitation that shaped the formation of the United States as we know it today. From the Louisiana Purchase to the Trail of Tears, from the Indian Removal Act to the boarding school system, the history of Native Americans is a story of profound injustice. But it is also a story of resilience. Despite centuries of oppression, Native American communities have survived. Their cultures, languages, and traditions have endured. And today, there is a growing recognition of the need to honor and preserve these rich heritages. Efforts to return land to Native American tribes, preserve sacred sites, and support indigenous sovereignty are vital steps toward reconciliation and healing. For those who seek to understand the full scope of American history, it is crucial to include the voices of Native American peoples. Their stories are not just a part of the past, they are integral to the present and future of this nation. By acknowledging the injustices of the past and working to address their ongoing impacts, we can move toward a more just and equitable society. Part 12. The Path Forward. Looking to the future, there are several key areas where progress is being made and where continued efforts are needed. Land-back movements. Several tribes have successfully reclaimed ancestral lands in recent years, setting a precedent for other indigenous communities to follow. These movements, known as land-back, aim to return control of sacred and culturally significant land to Native American tribes. This not only helps preserve cultural heritage, but also empowers Native communities to manage their resources and maintain their connection to the land. Environmental stewardship. Many Native American tribes have taken on leadership roles in the fight for environmental justice. Their deep connection to the land and traditional ecological knowledge has positioned them as key advocates for the protection of natural resources, wildlife, and climate change mitigation. In some cases, Native tribes have successfully blocked environmentally harmful projects, such as pipelines and mining operations, that threaten sacred lands. Cultural revitalization. Across the United States, there are ongoing efforts to preserve and revitalize Native American languages, arts, and traditions. Programs aimed at teaching indigenous languages to younger generations are crucial for maintaining cultural identity. Additionally, festivals, museums, and educational initiatives are working to share Native American history and culture with broader audiences. Legal and political advocacy. Native American leaders continue to fight for their rights in the political and legal arenas. Tribal sovereignty, land rights, and access to resources remain at the forefront of their advocacy. Native Americans are also increasingly being elected to political office, both at the tribal and national levels, where they can influence policy decisions that impact their communities. Part 13. A Story of Survival. The story of Native American survival is a testament to the strength and resilience of these communities. Despite the overwhelming forces of colonization, displacement, and cultural erasure, Native American peoples have held onto their identities, their traditions, and their land. Their stories remind us of the importance of honoring diversity, respecting human rights, and acknowledging the mistakes of the past. As we look ahead, it is clear that the fight for justice is not over. Native American communities continue to face significant challenges, but they also continue to demonstrate their capacity for survival, adaptation, and leadership. Their story is one that belongs not just to them, but to all of us who live on this land. It is a story that requires our attention, our respect, and our commitment to making things right. The history of how the United States colonized its own land offers important lessons for the present and future. It teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of viewing land and people as mere resources to be exploited. It shows us the importance of honoring agreements and treating all people with justice and dignity. Most importantly, it reminds us that the past is not something to be forgotten. It is something to be understood, acknowledged, and learned from. As we move forward, we must continue to listen to the voices of Native American peoples, support their rights, and work together to build a more just and equitable society for all.